So, hello everybody, welcome back to the live number 6 from UNICAT in Germany. Today the topic will be suspensions, shock absorbers and stabilizers. So again, chassis technical stuff. We don't have a video today, but I will give an overview of the different options and also the disadvantages, advantages, and our recommendations. And then I'm happy to answer your questions on these topics or whatever other questions you might have. Okay, suspension. So there are basically 4 different type of suspensions. It's leaf springs, it's coil springs, it's air suspension, and hydrostuds, while hydrostuds are quite rare. But I want to mention them here because it's a good system. Okay, most vehicles, most trucks come with leaf springs. And there are 2 types of leaf springs. The one is trapezoid leaf springs, and the other type is parabolic leaf springs. The parabolic leaf springs are longer and allow more wheel travel, and that's why for off-road conditions we typically prefer parabolic leaf springs if they are available. Then you also have to make a difference between a leaf spring suspension for a single axle or for 2 axles. So if there is only 1 axle, like typically the front axle, then you have a pair of leaf springs that holds the axle in place and allows the wheel to travel. Okay. Same happens on the rear axle if it's a 4x4 or on some 6x6 or 8x8. But normally if you have 2 axles in the rear, it's a combined package, and it's called a boogie axle. Both axles are sitting on 1 common spring, which actually has a big advantage over the situation where you would have 1 spring per axle. The boogie axle has the advantage that as that spring is mounted in the center between the 2 axles, and both axles are sitting on that spring, or better, the spring is sitting on the axle, the weight is always distributed 50% to 50% on each axle. And that pretty much happens in any situation, except when 1 axle is fully in and the other one is just hanging loose. Then, of course, the whole weight is on that 1 axle, but as long as they are not at their limit, the weight is properly distributed, which is a big advantage, because having half of the weight on each axle is at the same time the minimum weight you can have, and that's actually the advantage. Leaf springs are simple, they are easy to understand, easy to maintain if at all needed. They can easily be replaced, but they are big and they are heavy, and they don't offer the best wheel travel available. So another quite common suspension system for off-road vehicles are coil springs. So for example, the Unimog, Mercedes Unimog, let me just check here, yeah. And also the MAN CAT military vehicles have coil springs, and coil springs have the advantage that they allow more wheel travel which is good for off-roading because you keep your wheels on the ground for a long time. It's a relatively lightweight design, but on the other hand, you need axle guiding because you can't just mount the axle on the springs. It wouldn't stay in place. If coil springs break, it's a bigger problem to exchange them rather than leaf springs. But the big advantage is that they are quite sensitive and that they allow quite a lot of wheel travel. Another type of suspension is air suspension, and more and more modern vehicles have air suspension. It's the wheel travel is almost the same as on air suspension. On coil springs. Let me just close the window for a moment. She's taking care of everybody here. Okay, so the air springs have also quite a lot of wheel travel. They are lightweight, they are easy to exchange, but they are not available on so many vehicles, especially driven front axles. You will find rarely equipped with air suspension. Other than that, it's not a bad system, but as I said, it's on, especially on front axles, it's not so often available. Okay, another type of suspension are hydrostuds. Hydrostuds are hardly to get from any manufacturer. So some military vehicles have it, but the majority of trucks, commercial trucks and so on, they don't have hydrostuds. But I want to mention it because it's a nice system. Actually, it allows a lot of wheel travel, like almost 300 millimeters, which is 15 inches. You can adjust the riding height, what you with other suspensions can only do with air springs. It's quite compact. You can adjust the spring rate, so you can decide whether you want it softer or harder. Automatically with the hydrostuds, you have shock absorbers and you have stabilizers. And the very good thing is that the stabilizer is hydraulically, and by opening a valve or changing valve positions, you either have a superb stabilizer or you don't have a stabilizer. Why sometimes it's good to have a stabilizer and sometimes not, I will explain a little later. So now these are the suspension systems, and we use mainly the system that comes from the manufacturer. Why? I mean, every modification on a chassis is quite expensive, and if you don't have experience with that modification, it's also a risk that the chassis doesn't become better, but it becomes worse, or you break something. So staying with original parts, staying with something approved, staying with something that has been tested before it went to mass production has clearly advantages, and that's reliability. And that's why we typically don't change the suspension on a vehicle, except there are a couple of special reasons to do so. Now, if you stay with a standard suspension, you typically have leaf springs. Now, again, we come to the point where we say, okay, what can we do to make it reliable? So nothing is breaking, everything's working fine. Well, it's a very simple rule. You oversize it. So again, the rule where we say, if we have a vehicle that ends up with 12 tons total weight, we take an 18-ton chassis. So we are staying far away from the limits. Also, what the suspension is concerned. Now you might say, but then you have a super hard suspension and the ride will be bad. If you buy a truck new, you typically have a choice of leaf suspensions for different loads which are expected. So if you pick the right version, you already do something good to have a good ride. And then what you should also keep in mind that most of the trucks today have a suspended air seat. They have a suspended driver's cab. Then you have your leaf springs. And then you also have the off-road tires, which also give quite a lot of suspension. So you have actually 4 suspension systems, and sometimes it's even too much. And I wouldn't say that one of the parts has to do the whole job. And that's why typically we are fine with leaf springs. And again, the most important thing is leave it standard, leave it as it comes from the factory. So spare parts will be available. Mechanics will know how to work on it. So you have a pretty good backup when you're traveling, just in case you would get a problem on this. Okay. What else? Okay. So and again, leaf springs are not as bad as you might know. And if you test drive a truck and you are test driving just a chassis, the ride will be super hard because you don't have any load in the back. Maybe you don't even have a bed or anything on it, and you will say, oh, this is not comfortable, and might decide for another chassis which rides softer, while you can only judge the suspension properly once you have the vehicle fully loaded. And for example, many people say that air suspension is so great and so soft. Yeah, but it's great because it's always adapting to the real weight. But that's not really necessary on an expedition vehicle. Let's say you have a vehicle with 12 tons again, and that includes 600 liters of fresh water, and let's say 600 liters of fuel. So that adds up to 1,100 kilos roughly. So that's less than 10%. So your minimum weight and your maximum weight is just in an area of plus minus 5%. And that means that you can adjust a leaf suspension to that weight range, and you don't have to go for an air suspension, which would allow you to cover a weight range of, let's say, 5 tons to 12 tons, because that's just not happening on an expedition vehicle. Okay, so leaf springs are okay. Coil springs give you more wheel travel. Air suspension also gives you wheel travel, but is hardly available. And hydrostuds are super, but they are also super expensive, and they are complex. So a normal workshop wouldn't be able to work on hydrostuds. So our recommendation is go for leaf springs. If the truck has leaf springs, stick with what you have, and choose the right dimension so that it's okay for the weight or for more weight. Then you don't see problems and the ride will be okay with all the different size suspensions you have on the vehicle anyway. Stabilizers. So why should you have stabilizers on an off-road vehicle? The clear answer is yes and no. I mean, a stabilizer is reducing the lean of the vehicle to a side when you make a turn. It's generally stabilizing the ride, and therefore I think it's important to have stabilizers. Stabilizers both on the front and rear axles. So actually on each axle you should have a stabilizer. Simply by the reason that you spend 90% of your travel on good roads, maybe 9% on bad roads or tracks, but typically less than 1% in real off-road, and only a fraction of that off-roading would be better if you would not have stabilizers. So as much as, I mean, the stabilizer keeps the axle parallel to the chassis. That's the purpose, and it needs enormous forces to twist the stabilizer to create some lean. Now, when you go off-road and when you have uneven ground and when you want to stay with all the wheels on the ground, then of course the stabilizer is bad because it's lifting up one of the wheels, the one where you have a hole where you would want to have the wheel further down, and that's why it's limiting the off-road capability. Now there are systems where you have mechanical stabilizers which you can connect and disconnect. So sometimes they work, sometimes they don't work. Okay, you can do that. It's actually not that complicated to do it, but well, it's after all it's a complication, and you have to decide when to do it, and you can only release it when it's not under stress. So I would recommend to have stabilizers and to leave them in place all the time. Another part of the chassis, important part, are the shock absorbers or dampers, and that's a field where if you want to make an improvement on the chassis, that's where you can do it. Most shock absorbers which you get delivered with a truck from a manufacturer are more or less set up for road driving. So they are relatively soft to give you a soft ride, but they are not great dampers when it comes to bumpy roads or even going off-road. I mean, the job of the shock absorber is to reduce the inbound and outbound and jumping after you have hit something with your axle. So it goes in, it goes out, and if there wouldn't be a damper, it would go in and out, in and out, in and out, and you would have a crazy ride. So the shock absorber has to make sure that you get rid of that movement, and ideally you go into a bump and afterwards you have one movement and you are going straight again. Now the problem with shock absorbers is that to work perfectly, they would need to be adapted to the axle load. They would need to be adapted to the axle weight, so the unsprung mass weight, and temperature, and also tire size, tire pressure, all that stuff plays a role when you want to figure out what is the most comfortable and most safe way of driving. So typically the standard shock absorbers are not that great. So there are companies who offer adjustable shock absorbers. So you can dial and make them softer or harder. And that really works and makes a difference. But the problem is that if you can make them much harder and they are not getting really bigger, then they typically have an overheating problem. I mean, even with standard shock absorbers, when you drive off-road, when you're on track and it's quite bumpy, then you will realize that after some time, let's say half an hour, also depending on the temperature and the speed you go, that it's the ride is getting more bumpy, more loose, and that's simply because the shock absorbers get hot, and if they get hot, the viscosity of the oil is different, so it's more fluid, it flows faster, and that's reducing the damping as well. If you choose adjustable shock absorbers or harder shock absorbers, they should either have another reservoir or they should be much bigger, just to make sure that the shock absorber can get rid of the heat which is created by transferring movement into heat, because that's what happens in the shock absorber. You pick up the movement, you reduce the movement, but you create heat, and that heat is heating up the shock absorber, and it's only air cooled. So if you have a bigger shock absorber, you have more oil volume and you have more surface, and more surface means more cooling ability. Another option, and actually we do that quite often, is just to add another shock absorber. That sounds like the silly or too simple solution, but as by our experience, there is no ideal setting for a shock absorber, and you're not going to spend hours every day to find out the best setting. We are quite happy with installing double shock absorbers, and then we actually use something from the standard program. I mean, they typically have a softer and a harder version, and so you can do two soft ones, one soft one, one hard one, or two hard ones, to make some basic adjustment. But the big advantage is that you don't ask more from that shock absorber than what it's designed for. Actually, if it's sharing the load with another one, you will hardly use it at the limit, and that means it's not overheating, and it gives you good suspension for a long time. And another quite important reason is that standard shock absorbers are not expensive, and they are always available. We had cases where we had custom-built shock absorbers, and then they are built to your specifications, or you give the guys the weight and all the details they need to do the proper adjustment. But then you don't buy more than you need at that time, and if one breaks, then you are in trouble. You have a special shock absorber, delivery time 6 weeks, 8 weeks. And maybe you've also changed the brackets, so you can't even go back to a standard shock absorber. Then you have a problem. And if you have standard shock absorbers or serial products, and you have two of them and they break, you just exchange them. They are instantly available, and they are cheap. I mean, two of them are a fraction of what a special one costs. So I'm actually a friend of double shock absorbers rather than custom built shock absorbers. Okay, so I think I've talked almost half an hour now. Sorry, a little longer than the other times. So I'm happy to see your questions and to answer your questions. Okay, let me just have a little bit of water. And next time when you see me, I will have had a haircut. Now this is my Corona thing, that I haven't had a haircut for many weeks now. But you don't need to miss long hair for another reason, which I will explain at the end. Okay, so the first question here is, how can you lift the chassis when you have leaf springs? Okay, normally that's done by spacers. Yeah? So you put a spacer, a metal plate between the axle and the leaf springs package, and that simply gives you the lift of the thickness of your metal plate. Of course, the brides, or bolts, whatever is used, have to be longer, or at least long enough. Some are longer than necessary anyway, while normally we cut them because if you have the thread sticking out on the axle and you touch stones, then you damage the thread, and if you ever have to open it, it will be bad, or it can't be done. So we typically cut the part of the thread that's hanging out, except for a couple of millimeters, just to not to have collisions, and not to have a problem if you have to work on the system. Okay, but that's a different story. Now, spacers, yes, but be careful. Typically, there are already some spacers. Then you need to have a center bolt to position the axle properly together with the leaf springs. And what you need to know is that if you make too much spacers, then you get a lot of torque on the axle. As when the distance between the axle and the leaf spring is getting more and more, you get a larger lever, and that can actually bend the leaf springs, and it can become a problem. Also, the leaf springs, sometimes you might have seen rubber bumpers or parts at the rear part. I mean, not at the end, but further back than the center, you have a rubber part, and you might say, okay, why do they put a rubber part there? It's to stop the leaf spring when you are braking hard, because when you're braking hard, also the leaves are bending in a different way, so they are not just going in and out, they are also leaving like a wave, and these rubber parts are stopping that movement. But also, if you put too much spacers, that effect is also stronger. So be be careful if you put spacers. Maybe if you want to do it to level the vehicle, maybe it's even better to reduce the number of spacers at the rear axle. And also in some vehicles, you have to check if there is if it's just a plate, because when you change the angle of the prop shaft, then you can get what is it called? So in the end, you get a vibration from the drive shaft because the ingoing part of the flange of the drive shaft and the outgoing are no longer parallel. As long as they are parallel and the drive shaft is put together properly, you don't get vibrations. But if you change the angles, you get such crazy noise. And that can all come if you change the lift, if you put spacers and do not respect all these details. Okay, can you easily convert the suspension on a chassis from leaf springs to air suspension? Typically, no. On a double axle, on a 6x6, for example, it would be quite easy because the axle is guided not by the leaf springs, but by the guiding systems, by three arms. And so even if you remove the air spring, the leaf spring, the axles would exactly stay in place. Okay, so a double axle could be converted easily to air springs, but and on many MAN trucks, air springs are available on the rear axles, but we don't recommend it. We never bought. I mean, I've seen many vehicles with air suspension, but we never order them with air suspension because it doesn't really make sense. As said, if you know the weight of your truck, you can order the right size of leaf springs, and so you have a good functioning suspension. You have the proper weight distribution, 50%, 50%, which you don't have if you go to air springs. And also many people think with the air suspension you can level the vehicle really nicely, but that's not true. You can lift it up and lower it, but that's only one direction. If you want to level sideways, it's getting really difficult, and you can manage, let's say, 1, 2, maybe 3 degrees, but not more, because the stabilizer will prevent that. The stabilizer will just not allow, by the pressure difference you put to the right and left side, that it's moving a lot. So that's why changing a part to air suspension is doesn't really make a lot of sense. So it's not easy to change, and I don't see really a reason to do it, and so I would actually not recommend it. It's a long question from John. What are your thoughts about shock absorbers on a leaf spring vehicle? Is the stock factory fitted okay, or should you have a heavy duty version? I know an expedition vehicle is not a trophy truck. That's true. I mean, the faster you go, the more you have to work on the chassis, on the suspension, on the shock absorbers. If you go slow, it doesn't really matter. I mean, if you have a bicycle and you go just very slow down the road, you don't need suspension at the front and at the rear at all. While if you go off-roading, if you have an MTB, it's nice to have good wheel travel, or a motorcycle. You have to have good wheel travel front and rear, and where you typically also go quite fast. And the same is with a truck. So John is totally right, saying, well, you're not going that fast like in a race truck, and therefore the changes should be reasonable and limited. Still, the factory shock absorbers are often quite soft, but that you can already see on just on a bad road, even before you go into Africa or some places where you find easily bad roads. Yeah, even in Germany, around the corner, we have a road. They didn't service it for a long time because they want to make it new anyway. For us, it's a good test ground. So we go fast there with the trucks, and if it's okay there, it's quite okay. But if it's bad there, then we know, okay, we have to do something on the shock absorbers. So a heavy duty version is definitely a good thing, but make sure that you get shock absorbers that can stand the heavy load, because if they are overheating, in worst case, they get on fire. And when a shock absorber is on fire, if the oil is on fire, your truck is on fire, and it's hard to fix that. Okay, would you take shock absorbers as spare parts? Only if I have special shock absorbers. Yeah, then maybe it's a good idea to take a pair of shock absorbers with you. But if you use standard products, I think it's not necessary to take them with you. Also, typically shock absorbers don't die instantly. Either they just go bad, they become softer and softer, or they start leaking. But when they start leaking, it's time to think about how to get new ones. But it's nothing that really stops you from driving. And I would only take spare parts that ground you. So otherwise, you could take a whole truck in parts with you. What about active suspensions? Well, okay, not available, I would say. Ask McLaren, maybe they can do it. They definitely can do it. But I don't know of any truck who has really active suspension. And that's really top of the line for high speeds off-road driving. So I would say that's nothing you would really need or even want in an expedition vehicle. That is, in the end, is a tool to get you to the greatest places on this planet and allow you to stay there, to be safe there. But active suspension is for race trucks. So John is asking, we may call a stabilizer a roll bar in UK. Yes, yeah, a roll bar is a stabilizer. Sorry for my bad UK English. So next question, would you recommend fitting off-road spec MAN TGS 18360 4x4 truck with a heavy duty 4-inch to 5-inch suspension lift? If no, why? If you, I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't do it. I mean, 5-inch is quite a lot, and all what you get is a better angle of approach and departure. but the clearance underneath the axles is the same. Of course, the clearance underneath the transfer case, which is the lowest point typically, would also change. But ground clearance typically is not a big problem on this type of vehicles. We actually always have intense discussions with the customers what inside height the body should have. So you can say, okay, I'm 185, so we make it 190, just a little bit more, but a lot of head clearance gives a better feeling. So and there we are struggling, and we are arguing about each inch up and down, and just for that reason, and the reason is to keep the overall height low. Just for that reason, I would not lift the truck 4 to 5 inches to get more ground clearance. I would, if you want more ground clearance, I would put 1600 tires, which are possible on the TGS. And if you have a long wheelbase, you might even want to lift the transfer case a little bit. To stay in the limits of the angles of the prop shafts, which are getting more flat if you have a longer wheelbase, so you can lift up the transfer case a little bit to get back to that minimum angle or maximum angle. No, I wouldn't lift it. I wouldn't lift the chassis. No. How do you take care of level of the truck cabin when camping? We talked leveling systems on subframe last week, but what about the suspension itself? Does it make sense at all, and are there options? Well, the leaf springs don't give you an option. Coil springs don't give you an option. Air springs do a little bit, but never the whole wheel travel that it can go in and out if the axle goes in and out parallel. So sideways, it's just 1 inch, maybe a little bit more. So that doesn't help too much. What hydrostuds perfectly do that job, because you just adjust the amount of oil in each, which goes into the system of each cylinder, and you can do that. A leveling system really makes sense. So what people really appreciate if they have a leveling system, so they can just go to a super nice place with a nice view, but it's not even. So they say, well, I have a leveling system, I stay here and bring the truck in position. So it's quite nice to have it, but it's not really doable by the suspension. You can, that takes time. You can actually do it by reducing tire pressure or raising tire pressure on other wheels. But then next morning you have to, when you start driving, you have to bring them back to the proper pressure. So if I would be stopped for a week somewhere, nice place, I would actually try to do it with air pressure on the tires. Okay. Are nitrox shock absorbers better than others? Nitrox is used because the molecules are just bigger, and so they can't pass seals as easily as air could pass seals. So that's why nitrox is also used to fill tires on race cars, because they want to have a super constant pressure, and they don't want to have that much pressure change with temperature change. So it's a good thing to have, but it's not that the nitrox shock absorber must be principally a better product than the other one. But it's a good feature, no question. Little bit of water. Okay, in automotive suspension systems, we see active stabilizers or even automatic detachable stabilizers. Is that the thing for expedition vehicles as well? Principally, yes, but it would be super expensive to develop it and build it for one vehicle or for a few vehicles. Once we which we'll never do, but if you would sell 10,000 of the same unit per year, that would definitely something we would do. But there is a lot of development and cost involved, and that's why I think it doesn't exist for trucks. If it would exist really for all-wheel drive trucks, then we would order it. But that's just not in the market. Okay, so how much wheel travel is possible with the different types of suspension? Yeah, well, it depends. So a leaf spring must be long to allow a lot of wheel travel. So parabolic leaf springs, which we recommend for off-road vehicles, are longer, and so they allow more wheel travel. But I would say you typically have not more than 150 to 200 millimeters usable wheel travel. I mean, you could now just measure the length or the travel of the shock absorber and say, okay, that must be what the manufacturer expects from the leaf spring, but in reality, it's typically much less. So yeah, let's say leaf spring maximum 150 to 200 millimeters. With a boogie axle, where you have the two axles with one spring, you can actually have a lot of wheel travel or a lot of articulation. The wheel travel, if it goes in and out parallel, also is even less. It's maybe 120, 150 millimeters. Coil springs go up to 250 to 300 millimeters. Air springs as well. While if you have coil springs and air springs, they are sitting inside, and sometimes if there is a lever, then you get even more wheel travel. But let's say coil springs and air springs, 250 to 300 millimeters. Also hydrostats, if they are on a solid axle, it's also about 300 millimeters. If you have, for example, independent wheel suspension, then it can be way more. But I mean, if you have 300 millimeters, that's really a lot. And if you need that while driving, then it's quite demanding. It's more that you can use that just to have a lower ride on a highway and reduce the overall height of the vehicle. While when you go off-roading, you lift it up 4 to 5 inches to have more ground clearance. Yeah, but that's adjustable, and that's why it's so great. Yeah. Okay, you mentioned that truck manufacturers do not deliver trucks with air suspension on all axles, especially on front axle. What is the reason for that? Well, for example, there are a few trucks. For example, the Tatra with a central tube. There's a version where you have air suspension on all axles, but that's a very special axle design and truck. I think the simple reason is that it costs money. If you go for air suspension, then you need to have an axle guiding system, and that's all just more parts, more brackets, more money, more cost at the front axle compared to a simple leaf spring. And I think that's the only reason why they don't offer it. Wouldn't it be a big advantage to have full air suspension, not only for comfort, but for adjusting ride height based on the situation? High off-road for good capabilities, low on Autobahn saving fuel. This is completely right. But again, yeah, it's a big advantage, but it's not available. You can have air suspension on the rear, but if you only have it on the rear, it's typically just used to balance the weight and to keep it on horizontal, to level it horizontal, but you can't bring it up and down. That really would be a great advantage. You have that advantage on hydrostuds, and you would have it on air suspension, but I don't see it on the all-wheel drive trucks. Yeah. Are the differential on the MAN cut similar to MAN TGS? Actually, yes, they work the same way. It's I'm just thinking about the differential casing. Even is, I think it's the same or almost the same. I mean the cut has coil springs and also on the front axles, if that's the background of your question. But the differentials are pretty much the same. They work the same, but I don't think that you could just put cut axles under a TGS or vice versa. Okay, a mechanic told me that when the air suspension works very quickly in off-road, there is a possibility it breaks. Is it true? Well, I don't see a specific reason why air suspension should be more sensitive than leaf springs or coil springs. Yeah, actually, I'm not sure if that's true or not. I just don't know. Which type of suspension is more reliable? Well, they are all types are reliable if they are properly installed and if the load you put on it is not bringing it to the limit. But still, even if something is reliable, it can break. And if something goes wrong, then the question is, how easy is it to fix? And then, of course, a problem on a hydro studs, on a hydro pneumatic suspension is the most complex and complicated thing. Air suspensions are easy to change. Just the air spring itself, that can be done in half an hour by whoever. And it's quite easy to have a spare with you because you can. It's quite small when it's deflated. Coil springs, if you break them, you won't find replacements. So either you have them with you, you can't weld them. I mean, you can weld them, but it won't last long. So coil springs is not super easy to fix. Leaf springs are heavy, but they are worldwide known. They are simple. Even if you leave one blade out or replace it with one that doesn't perfectly fit, you can go on. You are not stopped. You are not grounded. That's why I would say they can all be reliable, but the leaf springs are the easiest to fix. Yeah. Okay. So Thomas, I'm seeking for your opinion out of two platforms. Well, okay. I think you already asked that question last time or in YouTube. You're talking about two specific vehicles, and how can I diagnose a truck? How can I say something about a truck where I only know the type, the year, and the mileage? For example, if you want to build a 6-meter body, I can tell you what wheelbase you approximately need, depending on the driver's cab, and assuming that you want a normal body and maybe spare tires in the back and so on. But it would be just guessing if I would say yes, that 18-ton is better or that 19-ton chassis is better. Sorry, there is no answer possible to that question. Sorry about that. Okay, so we have almost 7, and so let's finish for today. As I said, you don't have to miss long hair. Sorry for the joke, Thomas. Other Thomas. Well, I want to introduce Thomas Vaas to you, my partner in UNICAT. He's with UNICAT since 2006. He's a super nice guy. He has traveled with his UNICAT for 7 years until 14. He's living in Africa for part of the year, and he will do the live next Monday because we don't want to only talk about technical stuff here. We also want to talk about travel experience, and all the components, all the parts of this exciting life. Of course, I'm more specialized in the technical stuff, but Thomas has the experience on the road, and actually he's our hardest tester, in-house tester, and here he is. Thomas, welcome. He just came back from Africa, where he spent the cold months in Europe, in the sun, and so Thomas will be available next Monday, and if you just want to say a few words to the visitors, please do it.
Hi everybody, and thanks Thomas for introducing me. I just came back from Africa last Sunday, and I'm spending another week in quarantine. So next Monday I'll finish it, and I'm very happy to talk about my travels. I spent more or less half my life in Africa now, and I'm very fond of that continent. The travels there were just really memorable. I'll show you some pictures, have some nice stories, and I'm very happy to answer all your questions. Thank you.
Good, great. Yeah, so please, if you want to get reminded, you need to subscribe the channel, and then you push the bell, and then you get a reminder that Thomas will be there next Monday, 6 o'clock German time, same as the last times. And I know he has to tell a lot of stuff, and he can answer so many questions. I'm happy he's with us. So thank you, everybody. Have a good day or a good night. Stay healthy, and see you again next Monday on UNICAT YouTube channel. Thank you. Bye-bye.